Good morning. I'm Joan Combs-Darso. On behalf of the IAFFE Online Events Committee, I would like to welcome you to today's Fireside Chat. Our topic is the methodology of feminist economics history. And this is the first one in a series on the methodology of history and economics. Today, we speak with two authors of brand new books who have taken on the history of economics as seen through a feminist lens. We also have ongoing events through a number of other event tracks. So please look out for those and see. You can also see past events on the IAFFE YouTube channel. I will put the link for that in the chat. Like those past events, today's event is being recorded and it will be available for you. So we ask you to keep your sound muted when you're not speaking. We invite your active participation in the Zoom chat. Please feel free to share resources, references, events, and your questions for our speakers. To help us find your questions, please type them in the chat, starting with the word question. It helps to identify yourself if you haven't put your full name on the Zoom when you join the meeting. Our moderator today is Shraddha Jain, who's a doctoral candidate at the Center for Development Studies in Kerala, India. She's pursuing her PhD in economics using interdisciplinary approaches. Her research interests are in gender relations, women's paid and unpaid work, intra-household bargaining, and domestic work. Edith Kuiper, one of our two authors, is chair of the department and associate professor in the Department of Economics at the State University of New York at New Paltz. Her latest book, A Herstory of Economics, was published in July 2022 by Polity Books and is being distributed by Wiley Press. Her prior books include Feminist Economics and the World Bank with Drusilla Barker and Women's Economic Thought in the 18th Century. Her doctorate is from the University of Amsterdam. Edith was an organizer in the Out of the Margins conferences and served as IAFFE president in 2006-2007. Our second author is Anne Marie May, a Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, with courtesy appointments in history, women's studies, and agricultural economics. Her book, Gender and the Dismal Science, Women in the Early Years of the Economics Profession, was published by Columbia University this summer in 2022. She served as the executive vice president and treasurer of IAFFE from 2006 to 2016. Shraddha, it's all yours.
You'll want to unmute.
Unmute, Shraddha.
There you go.
Thank you, Joan, and sorry for this cup. It has been honor and pleasure to be part of this conversation and learn from such eminent scholars. I have my chances to go through these fascinating books, and I must say all of us will have some afterthought getting along this book. So I'll get started telling you about the structure of this conversation. Our two authors will speak briefly about their books, and we'll then move on to some question and answers. Please feel free to put your questions and comments and share resources in the chat. Kindly start your question with the word question to guide us through the questions better. In this conversation, we will be talking to the scholars who address the question, where are the women in economics, but in very different ways. Professor Anne Marie May illustrates how women have been underrepresented or have been missing from economics as a profession, while Professor Edith Kuiper demonstrates women's writings about economics that have rarely come to the forefront. It is exposed that economics as a discipline that has been the proponent of free market has rarely been free for women. In the book titled Gender and the Dismal Science, Professor Anne Marie talks about barriers women faced in entering into economics as higher education and as a profession. She also discusses how women lacked spaces for academic discussions, especially through her profound analysis of old boy network of publishing. Through her book, we also see the emergence of economics as scientific profession. I re-quote the statement she uses from The Economist magazine. Something is broken within the market of economists, and the profession has moved only belatedly and partially to address it. A lack of inclusivity is not simply a problem in itself, but a contributor to other troubles within the field. Interestingly, Professor Edith, in her story of economics, informs us that there have been women writing economics and there have been women economists who have not made it to the history of economic thought. She takes us through the time period between 1700 and 2020 and covers topics ranging from education, property rights, production, finance, and so on, and shows us the canvas of women's writing. She also takes us through the evolution of economics as a profession from being called economica, if I've pronounced it correctly, which actually means a household in Greek language, to being referred to as political economy and then economics. She also exposes references to the field's reliance on assumptions of rational economic man and of homogeneous human conditions and behaviors. Through today's talk, we hope to learn about authors' methodologies for undertaking these projects, why it is important to learn about these projects, and how women are placed in the profession today, including intersectionally and interregionally. We also request them to reflect on each other's works and share their thoughts. This is also an attempt to kickstart a series of conversations reflecting on the methodology of feminist economic history. Getting started, for the first section, we asked the authors to introduce their work and their particular books. And our particular questions to them are as follows. How did you get started in this history, specifically history of economics and parts women played in its development? Secondly, what drove you to turn them into books? I invite Professor Mary to initiate the conversation, which would be around 5 to 8 minutes, and then Professor Edith would take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shraddha, for that nice summary of the work. In this book, I provide an examination of the role that gender played in the professionalization of economics in the US and the difficulties in the early years for women. And by early years, I cover 1885 to World War II. And what I do is to use novel data sets and empirical analysis to examine questions of gender and membership in the AEA, doctorates earned, publishing both book manuscripts and in academic journals, and employment after the doctorate. And I just can't go further without saying that I have many students to thank for the tedious task of collecting a lot of data. So as everyone knows, doing economic history usually involves collecting a lot of data, and or often does, and I want to thank them right off at the start. My approach is really determined by a challenge that I set for myself in writing the book, which was to weave a narrative that captured women's experiences in the early years using the stories of women themselves, along with the empirical data of those experiences in the areas I just mentioned. So what you'll find is that most of the chapters include a story about an individual that I found particularly moving, and that I also found representative of what the data reveal. So there are stories about Sadie Mosel Tanner, Leah Mae Brown, Eleanor Lansing Dulles, Lucille Eves, and Phyllis Ann Wallace that help to really make the analysis real. And it demonstrates that there are indeed, and reminds us that there are very real and personal impacts of the institutional practices that were adopted during this time period. And Secondly, I want to mention that early on, I became aware of the importance of providing a narrative that reveals these institutional barriers that were facing women of color in particular in the economics profession. And relying on empirical analysis alone would have written women of color out of the history of the profession. Therefore, providing detail on the impediments that these women faced, for example, in women's colleges, such as the Seven Sisters and elsewhere, is important. It's an important element of the story of women in economics in the profession. I guess it's also helpful to know what a book is and what a book isn't. The book is not focused on the history of ideas per se, history of economic thought, nor is it economic history, the study of events of the past. But I would probably characterize it more as a study in the sociology of knowledge. Who gets to participate in the construction of knowledge, and what were the factors that determined whether or not one could participate. The origin of the research you asked about, it began in the AEA, probably began in the AEA archives when they were located at Northeastern University in Boston. They've since moved to Duke University and remain at Duke. When I was visiting the archives, I was looking for information on the early years of the AEA, and I came across a file that was marked trouble, something to do with trouble. And this, of course, piqued my interest. So I requested the file, opened it, and discovered that it was correspondence between the new editor of the AER, which was Davis R. Dewey, a female economist, Lucia Leaves, and it was on a review of her recently published book that was her dissertation. And it was a review done by a fellow student from her same university, Ira Cross. And what unraveled when you follow and pull at the yarn of this particular tale is a really sort of revealing story about old boy networks and what it meant to be a woman publishing in the period where we were moving from publishing manuscripts into publishing in academic journals. So in sort of broader terms, I would say that the book examines the reality of that faced women economists, that often prevented them from getting the same education as their white male counterparts. And when they did manage to get that education, channeled them into very different entry-level positions. And the impact of things like marriage bars, which were rules at universities that prevented married women from being hired, or if they were hired, called for them to be fired, and were used to exclude women, along with anti-nepotism rules that followed this to also work to keep them out. And there's one theme that is woven throughout the book, which it sort of focuses in on the discipline of economics and the content. And economics is a discipline known for waxing poetic about the virtues of a free market, and that took on the moniker of the study of choice. And nothing could be further from the truth for the women who attempted to participate in this free market. So the ideology of economics must surely have been a bitter pill for women at the time to swallow. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for those initial remarks. I'll invite Professor Edith to make her intervention.
Hey, thank you for inviting me, Shraddha, for your kind introduction. It's great to be here. I really look forward to the discussion later on, to any questions that people may have. I got interested in the functioning of economic science as a social institution rather early in my studying economics. So I loved reading methodology and history of economics. And then I got active in a group of women in economics. And we organized a conference on the role of gender in scientific research. And then I read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, especially his theory of moral sentiments. And it struck me how Adam Smith did not talk about women. So if you read that book by yourself, you just read the first pages, it becomes very strikingly, flagrantly absent women were, right? So analyzing the role of gender in the history of economic thought, which I've been doing for many years now, is a complicated thing. It's not easy, and that has to do with the fact that economics and gender are both over the century changing entities, right? And they impact each other. So, for instance, gender as defined in 18th century England had an impact on political thought of the day, and in turn, this political economic thought became ingrained in the perception of what an economy entails and what women's position is, women's role should be in the economy, and then vice versa. If women's position, the moment that the position of women had changed, right, these ideas became naturalized and subsequently were claimed as facts and were used as a basis for new economic ideas and as backups for normative notions about gender relations. So there is this whole movement and change going on. How do you analyze that? How do you conceptualize that? So I wrote my master's on an exploration of the literature in women's studies and economics, and my PhD on developing a method on how to analyze gender in historical economic texts. And I used, to do that, I used feminist scholars. So I used Joan W. Scott, a historian, famous feminist historian, and the feminist philosopher Sandra Harding to build a framework to analyze the gender industry of economic thought. So then I received a fancy research grant for 3 years, which was really nice. So, I would suppose that this was my proposal to analyze the work of Adam Smith from a feminist perspective. But I found it less productive, and it was possible for me to change this, my focus, and I decided to dig up the women's voices of Adam Smith's feminist contemporaries. These voices that had been silenced in the process of bringing about political economy and later economics. Very different from the responses of my colleagues that were very defensive when I attacked Adam Smith, who was the father of economics, right? Now the response became very, very enthusiastic and supportive. That was interesting, I thought. Okay, so my interest in the book, indeed, Shraddha, it goes way back to the Greek philosopher Xenophon, and includes this period in economic thinking that focuses on the household, right? Economia is the study of the household. And then it addresses the 18th century, the emergence of political economy, and it runs until today when mainstream economics is still dominant. So my idea was to understand how economics is gendered. And in order to understand that, you have to include these early economic ideas, particularly of that emerged in political economy, and how gender has structured these basic notions, for instance, about the definition of the economy, definition of the role of women in the economy, and how those notions of masculinity and femininity became ingrained in these basic concepts that are still with us when we talk about the market, when we talk about efficiency, when we talk about public and private, and when we talk about the household. So, so therefore I focused on the 18th century and women's writing in the 18th century, because the emergence of political economy and political economy itself is kind of as the basis that today's economics has been built on. Okay, so my general hypothesis in the book, and it was only strengthened, I was flabbergasted in some moments. What I found was that over the centuries, gender has had a rather central role in the construction of political economy, of economics, and this has become part of the core content of the study of the economy. So it's not like a separate topic. It's really, if you want to understand the development of economic thought, you have to understand the role of gender in the emergence of economic thought. And I'm now working also on the ideas around race, right, which is a whole different chapter. I come to talk about it later, I hope. So because these notions are mostly sometimes explicit, very explicit, right? But mostly they're implicit. So you have to know where to look, so to say. By listening to those excluded voices of women, those neglected and excluded women economic writers and women economists, my idea was that I would be able to retrace what has been ideas, topics that had been excluded from political economy and later economics. And also to kind of, by putting women's voices on the table, decentralizing, marginalizing, if you like, the current myth around history of economic thought. About my book, one of the surprises that I found was looking at women's voices was that there were a lot of women economic writers who were not linked specifically to the field of economics, but they wrote about economic issues. Think about, for instance, Mary Wollstonecraft and Barbeau, and novelists like Jane Austen, right? Very relevant here is that you know about the context of the time and that women did not have any access to higher education at that point, let alone that they had appointments at economic departments. So university like Cambridge and Oxford, right? And Smith went to Oxford, they did not even give women access to the premise. There were no women there, right? So their economic ideas had to be expressed elsewhere and in other genres. So I have been widening the boundaries of what I consider economic writing to understand women's ideas about the economy and about economic issues. Collecting the work of women economic writers in the UK and the US, as I've been doing, and I presume that accounts for all over the world. It's a wonderful thing to do. So I can really, recommend diving into that. These are such interesting women, such interesting figures. It's like doing excavations and finding dinosaurs all the time, right? So you pick a woman, you don't know anything about her or a little bit, and then, wow, she appears to have written a book, and look, this book's about economics. What's it? Amazing. So, and then you're the first one to do that. So for instance, women like Frances Wright. Anybody knows about Frances Wright? I doubt it, right? She was an early socialist writer. She was educated, very shielded in Scotland, but she moves to the United States on her own. She started her own socialist community in Tennessee in order to develop a way to free enslaved people. Ever heard of her? No. Did she write? Yes, she wrote a lot. I didn't have the time to write or read all her work. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Her time, Harriet Martineau is another example. Some of you might know her better. Another example is Beatrice Potter Webb, the wife of Sidney Webb, who's more famous as an economist. She engaged in empirical research on poverty in London. It's a lot of other people. And later in life, she determined that the sex of a worker was a major factor in determining the level of the workers' wages, right? So if the height of the wages were importantly determined whether you were a man or a woman. Okay, she puts that down to paper and she concludes that we can speak in her days of women's wages and men's wages. Important work, if you read about it, I don't think so. Yes, so this important work has been excluded out of the history of economic thought. And guess what? The prevalent argument has been that these women's work did not have enough impact on later economists, right? So they become excluded, and then that becomes the reason why they don't turn up in history of economic thought. So this goes back to what Anne-Marie May kind of mentioned in her book when she describes the process of professionalization. And the aim for the field to set its own standards and its own agenda, right? And women and women's research were not very high on that agenda, and they were mostly absent. A few words about my book. I'm going about over my time a little bit, I think, because I got involved in feminist economics at an early stage. I always have tried to bring people together on specific themes and get them to do the right thing, right? So I organized conferences, sessions at conferences, and I edited books, right? And then you can say, well, why don't you write about this and stuff like that? So, and I did that with my dear colleague, Priscilla Barker. We were a good team. So, and then Routledge asked us to come up with a collection of articles on feminist economics to kind of present the most important articles in the field, which is always a difficult thing to do, because who do you include and who do you not include? But then I asked my editor, could I come up with a book or a series on 18th century women in economic thought? And he said, oh yeah, sure, if you have enough material, send me a proposal. So what I did is I collected 3 volumes with original text. So these are mostly full text. And they were published in 2014. So it gives you, and also me, a kind of a data set to start from, right? So these are texts from the 18th century that most historians of economics are unaware of. So this whole field of women's economic writing, specifically, if you want to do that as an integral part of the development of economic thought, right? You don't want to make it a very specific topic. No, you want to integrate it in the development of economic thought. It's a huge topic. So I thought, how do I do that? It will cost me 20 years of my life. I don't have those 20 years anymore. So then I was contacted by Gert Owen of Polity Press, which you talked about. And he said, why don't you write undergraduate textbook? And I thought, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. It should be fun to do. And that's a workable format. Oh, I did that. And there it is. It's Herstory of Economics. And I would really love to hear what you think of it. I would leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for explaining your experiences about undertaking this project. So what I learned from both of your introductions is that you actually, both of you use interdisciplinary approaches using historical frameworks and using different methodologies, using empirical evidence differently to come up with these books. So moving forward, so our next question to both of you is about the physical work related to this project. Like, for example, Professor Mary accessed a lot of archives related to American Economic Association. We would love to know how that physical work went into. It will be helpful for scholars who intend to do archival work in such fields. And to Professor Edith, our question would be like, you had list of about 100 women economic writers, and what we realized that only 20 were alive after 1915. So how did you get that, compile that all information? To follow up, a broad question to both of you is, what makes feminist economic history different from what we have talked about in the political economy? Thank you. Please, Professor Mary, and then Professor Edith.
Okay, thank you. So archival work isn't for everybody. I started to do archival work when I was doing very different research and visited presidents' archives in the US. And archival work requires that you go, you ask, how do you actually do this work? You go to the archives, and you have to go for a period of time because it takes time to review the files and get them back. You review the file summaries, you select the files that you want to examine. And then, it's a bit like, for me, it's a bit like opening a present. You don't know what you're going to find. In reality, it's a very slow process of opening a present. Like most academic work, what you'll review will prove to be unimportant and uninteresting, but you will come across that occasional, memo from an editor to a writer, and cross being the reviewer, and you pull on that string, and then you look in other files and you find that there's a mosaic here, a real story that reveals something about Old Boy, in this case, Old Boy networks, and how they worked in the AEA. My primary field in graduate school was US economic history. So when I graduated, I continued to do research on political business cycles. But the second year that I was an assistant professor, the students that I worked with wanted to bring Gloria Steinem to campus. And so I helped them to raise money, and it was a great pleasure of mine to listen to her views on feminism throughout the day. And in the car on the way to dinner, she asked me about my research, and I told her that I was studying, what at the time would have been probably the most white male privileged research there is, how presidents manipulate the economy to get reelected. And she just sort of gently urged me to consider integrating gender into my interests, research interests. And as you know, she has a great affinity for economics. Well, shortly after that, one of the newspapers in my state called my chair of the department to get a recommendation for an expert to speak on issues of presidents and manipulating the economy. And so I was unaware of this, though, until I saw the story featuring my department chair as the expert, a department chair who specialized in international trade. And so that's when I began examining employment outcomes for women in red states and blue states, examining women economists like Lucille Eves, who taught for a while at the University of Nebraska, Minnie Thorpe England, who also taught there. And I began to focus then after that on survey research, examining gender differences in views on economists and policy issues. So the two things that I have pursued, archival research and survey research, have traditionally been sort of skewed by the profession. And they're increasingly, I think, as more women enter the profession, the methodologies and approaches are starting to open up, which I see as a very good thing. And I just wanted to also follow up on one of Edith's comments, which is that I too found that the study of gender is not peripheral to, in my case, the examination of the professions. And that most of the histories of the profession, I'm thinking of the work of Andrew Abbott, don't integrate or address gender in their discussions. And yet, the professions were emerging at a time when women were beginning to challenge educational norms, paving the way for their inclusion into the professions. So it really is an important, there were important discussions, reactions, backlashes that took place. And it isn't peripheral, it isn't a separate chapter, it should be part of an integrated story. But I'll stop there.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks.
Thanks,
Please
carry on.
Anne-Marie. So my route was, as expected, slightly different. My initial focus was the philosophy of economics. So from that angle, I moved into doing more historical research. And what I did, kind of like practical work, was more of a collector, right? So I was interested in finding women and finding publications that that women wrote inside economics, but mostly outside economics. So I was lucky that I could start with the University of Amsterdam, which had a pretty good library. Then I went to Oxford Library, the library in York for a week. So British Library. When I was in California, I went to Huntington Library. So and there's some more, but just kind of looking around, seeing what I could find. I had some. It's like what you say, Henry. Like you have a thread, and you keep on pulling, right? So your names pop up, and then I thought, oh, I've never heard of that. Frances Wright is an example. And then you start reading, and it's just amazing what you find. So I also noticed and learned that a lot of the material is available online. There are great online sources, finding old texts. Echo is one of them. It's not cheap to get access to that. 18th century online resources that. But I went to a lot of those. Can you hear me? Those sources, and I just collected texts. And what I noticed is that there was a lot of work available outside history of economics. So I went to a conference for women's and gender history, for instance, and there are scholars who study women's literature who have been writing about women writing in their novels about economic issues, right? So and then what you say, Shraddha, is you have to kind of get out of economics. At least I had to get out of economics to explore what's been done in economic history, what's been done in literature, what's been done in philosophy, and find these authors that appear to have done not only writing poems in English, but also like Elizabeth Montagu. That's a good example. She is was the queen of the Blue Stockings. I don't know if you're familiar with that. This was a group of mostly aristocratic women in the time of Samuel Johnson and James Boswell in London. Elizabeth Montagu was very visible culturally, but she also owned coal mines. And she had estates, and she expanded those estates, bringing in very, very hip architectures, right? So there's this whole economic side to her that she has written about in her thousands of letters that they have in the Huntington Library. So, I figured that out, and then I went to the Huntington Library, and then I realized, well, you can get these letters online. So I worked as a student, we got a set of letters, we translated them, and one of the letters is included in these 3 volumes. So just, and that way, you find your way through the literature. So yeah, in that sense, you could say I kind of, to some extent, created my own database, but I'm not an empirical researcher, but these texts are my empirical basis, right? So I collect these texts and I analyze them, and from these texts I subtract themes and arguments and ideas. So that is I think I can tell you. And you had a second question. What makes feminist history of economics different?
Yes, yeah. How the topics that feminist writers have dealt with, or women have dealt with, are different. So if both of you can reflect on the same question.
Okay, let me kind of just wrap that up then. Is that my experience is that when you do a feminist history of economic thought, and one of the reasons that a lot of men shy away from doing that is that you also have to know about gender history. Right? You have to know about the norms and values, about what Henry May writes about institutional regulations, right? that concern women and men at the time. So you have to have additional knowledge to know, to really kind of be able to make, to build an understanding of the role of gender in the history of economic thought. So not only do you have to find these new texts, you have to know about your gender, women's and gender history at the time. And if you want to relate it to the history of economic thought, you also want to know about that, right? It kind of comes normal, but it's additional work, work that traditional historians of economics don't have to do. Traditional history of economic thought was had an internalist approach, meaning that they only focused on the arguments between white guys, right? With the idea that history of economic thought developed through rational discussions between men, so to say. But that we stepped away from that. We understand that what's going on in the context, like wars, like economic crises, like the pandemic, that all these are big factors that have impact on the development of economic thought, and notions about gender, institutions around gender, and institutions about race, norms around racial differences, all have their impact on the development of economic thought. So it requires that you take a much broader perspective.
Professor Emery, your thoughts on the same?
Yeah, I'm just, want to say that I totally agree with Edith that, one of the challenges, but also one of the reasons why the research isn't as prevalent is because one does have to have an interdisciplinary perspective, and one does have to be familiar with actual history of events, with institutions and how they operated. And, these sort of ontological boundaries that have been set in economics in the past sort of pushed just those issues to the periphery and into other disciplines. So that's not economics, that's history. That's not economics, that's sociology. And that makes it difficult to analyze and to fully discuss the history of women in the profession. And so I totally agree that has been one of the sort of barriers and difficulties in analyzing women. Yeah.
Great. So related to what we have been talking about, we have a question from the audience. We have a question from Gulia who asks, working on female economists working in the process of European integration in the after Second World War, we found the use of oral archives and secondary sources essential for defining women's contribution. Was it the same in your case? So maybe either of you or both of you can respond to the question. You're muted.
Oh.
Edith, yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Edith. Go ahead.
Well, yes, in the sense, this is also about broadening the boundaries, right? When you talk about 18th century women, there's no oral history, that may be clear, but there are diaries, there are letters, there are all kind of pamphlets, books for children that I've been gratefully made use of to get an idea of the economic ideas of women, right? And I had not thought about oral history. Because I focused on these earlier centuries, but I think that would be a great source indeed. Yes, definitely, and makes us again rethink about how we do feminist economic history of economic thought, but also history of economic thought, right? And right now you see that that's also a topic in right, non-feminist Duke University, John may kind of say that, for oral history of getting interviews, getting these materials that consist of that kind of material.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that. So Sadie Mosul Alexander also has a oral history from an interview that she did, and it was several interviews, but it's just so important to read women's voices themselves, whether you do, narrative history, whether you integrate it with empirical work, or whether you are going to focus entirely on empirical work. It's important to read those histories and hear their voices. And they just resonate with so many challenges of women in the discipline today. So I'll stop there because my siren is going off.
Can I?
Sure, please.
Yeah, just one more thing is that I found myself writing much more than traditionally is being done, writing about these women's lives, because for me it appeared to be relevant to know a few facts about these women economic authors. And of course, the tradition has been a much strong separation from the rational arguments that economists brought in and the way they live their lives, right? But I think that maybe feminist, from a feminist perspective, you have a more obvious idea that these are not to be separated. When you want to understand some of these ideas, you want to understand how they live their lives. That's the case for me.
Thank you. So we move on to the later part of our conversation. So we observed that these two books are more or less or mostly focused on Europe and North America and the development of economics as a profession in the West. In Edith's book on women who wrote about economics, and in Aunt Mary's on women's economics in the 20th century. So it's also related to how economics emerged as a profession. How do we extend this work intersectionally and interregionally, and whom we need to hear from other regions? How do we go ahead? And related to this, we have a question from audience, which we'll take after your interventions. Please, Professor Ain, maybe.
Oh, okay. So it's an important question, and it's an important thing for anyone who's writing to consider and not forget. But there are challenges to it. I mentioned that, if one was going to do strictly empirical research, that women of color during this time period would have been written out of the history. And so you have to reflect on it. You have to remember that it is important to understand and explain not only the women who are there and what they're doing, but the women who weren't there and who were excluded. And that requires, as Edith mentioned, a knowledge about the history, an understanding of the institutions. And, with economists, for example, it's so remarkable that they could emphasize so much of the free market, and that is part of their ideology. And yet in their own lived experiences, their work environment, they lived in anything but a free market. And so it is important to understand why and explain and discuss why individuals were excluded for a variety of reasons, and continued to be excluded for a variety of reasons. So I think it's an important aspect. On the issue of interregionality, there are books that will take the topic and work across cultures and society. And I'm thinking of, some of the work of Bob Dumond, and there are books that will focus on a particular country. You get benefits from both. And so encouraging an environment where, both types of research can flourish is a very useful thing.
If I can add to that, I agree that you know it's important. It's difficult to. It's important to have books on. Like there are now books coming out of Italy that I'm aware of. I should have kind of checked the title, but and there's work on South America, for instance, feminist economic writing in South America, very, very important. I cannot read Spanish. I can write a book about the Netherlands, about the Dutch tradition, but you know, we need other people, you here online, to tell the discipline about the kind of women's economic writing that has been done in your countries. So I want to mention one more thing. What I also mentioned earlier is that I think we have to really make a strong point that women's that the writing of women in the history of economic thought is part of the history of economic thought. It's not a specific topic. And we have to take this broader perspective, and out of that broader perspective is also how race played a role in the development of economic thought. So we've started out by digging up neglected women, right? That's how this kind of topic started out. And a lot of people are still doing that, and that is really good work. It's like a basis, but we have to kind of move beyond that, building on that kind of research to figure out how gender and race and class and location has structured economic thinking, right? Because that is one of the main aims, is that the fact that women were absent in economic thinking and that men have still been able to claim that economic thought was objective. Imagine, right? So women's questions and interests have not been addressed in economic thought, and yet men whose questions and interests were addressed in economic thought, they just claimed objectivity. This is objective because, you know, we're just not looking, we just not take into consideration what women are interested in, what the interests are of people of color, what the interests are of the working class people. So that kind of structuring and using economics as a tool to silence women, using economics as a tool to silence people of color, marginalizing them. Those are very important questions that, you know, they make some people really uncomfortable, but maybe we need to do that. We need to make some people really uncomfortable. So the decentralization of the history of economic thought, I think, needs to happen. And I think that bringing in women's voices, neglected women's voices, is a great way to do that. It's interesting, it's broadening your horizon, it's funny, it's inspiring, and it has a good result. Okay, sorry, I just took off a little bit.
So to add to this, we have Sophie from our audience who has mentioned that they have recently published about Russian feminist economics. I think it would be wonderful if people can refer to such resources to get inter-regional perspectives. And then now we have Gulia talking from about Italy as well. So there are some links put on there. So I hope those will be useful. So so we are towards the end of our conversation. So I would encourage the people in the audience to make some comments or questions that they would like to interact with the authors in any way. We welcome and encourage you to have your comments or questions. Please feel free to put those, or you can either raise your hands or put them into the chat. John, do you want to say something?
I wanted to kind of ask if there are, I mean, we've had questions about the interregionality and intersectionality of the work of our authors. And I wonder if, and I think Edith's point about this being a very important that this not be a separate field, that including women in economic history is not a new topic. It's a part of economics and economic history that you have both so eloquently written about. It's taken women's organizations, feminist organizations, to really push these topics. But how do we keep that from being segregated as the women's history in economics subfield?
Joan, can you say that last sentence again? I couldn't hear.
Yeah, how do we keep, to your, both of you have written eloquently about this important gap that is a fundamental part of economic history. How do we keep that from being segregated and limited to, we're going to publish this in those women's journals? How do we keep this from being limited mostly to the feminist organizations that are part of the profession that have pushed for these things for years?
I think it's published in general economic history of economic thought journals, right? Knock on the door, organize sessions in which there is one feminist historian of economics, and the rest is if you want to talk about mainstreamers. I mean, you have to make the point that this is part of the core of the field, so to say. I lost my job on a certain moment because I was not considered, my research was not considered part of the field. But you have to fight back, right? You have to stand up and explain to them that this is part of the field. And I just hope that books like that of Anne-Marie and mine will give people arguments to show that this is part of the field, and that gender has been very, like race and class, have been very important in structuring our economic thought. Economic thought is not the produce of a set of rational male minds. That is a myth. And we have to kind of, take the fields elsewhere, and the field is going elsewhere. So we have the tide with us. So I want to be positive about where we are going in history of economic thought. There is really a fertile ground for work like Anne-Marie's and mine. The reception until so far has been really friendly. So I'm really happy to see that.
And I would just add the importance of professional associations. And we all know that, acting as individuals is very difficult, but to accomplish this kind of change, but working together and through professional associations like IAFFE, but also pushing, on other organizations to open up, look at your board and write research about it, expose it, is an important part of what you're talking about, Joan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Attend conferences of the history of economic society, just become a member of them. So as a feminist economist, you always have to do this double work, right? You're part of your feminist economics organization, but you also have to be part of of other professional organizations, which is fun. But it's a bit more. But it's what you need to do.
Okay.
Jihi has promised us, if you have questions and want to chat for a few minutes, we won't end the meeting just immediately. I would like to thank our moderator, Shraddha Jain, for guiding the conversation. And I'd like to thank our two authors and recommend you buy their books or get your library to buy their books. They're very good read. There was like almost a surprise on every page for me, or a reminder of something I hadn't thought about in a while. So thank you for these books, and thank you for chatting with us about it in our session, methodology section on this history. We would like to encourage you. Hortensia asked a question about colonization. Stay on and talk with us about setting up panels for that and setting up regional events on that topic. Not that it's limited to any one region. We would like to thank the online events committee, thank Jihi Jolly for setting up and hosting and organizing our Zoom session. And thank you all for interesting questions and for attending. And please come back, look for more in the IAFFE newsletters. Thank you.
Thank you.